Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the session, Discovering Nepantla, Learning to Live Liminally to Bridge Disparate Worlds, presented by Dr. Mitchell Culver. If you have questions for Dr. Culver, please type them in the chat box, and we will address them during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Dr. Mitchell Culver serves as Associate Provost for Engagement and Retention at the American Public University System. A thought leader in the field of higher education, Dr. Culver maintains his professional focus on professional empowerment, organizational efficiency, and student success. As a change management consultant in the realm of student success analytics, he is frequently invited to champion the idea that student success can best be fostered through increased intentionality amongst faculty, staff, and executives. Dr. Culver believes that human empowerment and collaboration enhanced by emerging technologies are the most powerful tools that 21st century institutions have. His research has appeared in Popular Science, Discover, Slate, Smithsonian, New York Magazine, and Radio BBC. His prominence in the field has allowed him to serve as a consultant for online pedagogy and change management for universities around the globe. On a personal note, and I forgot to tell you, I'm Susan Lohman-Thomas in the English department. I find Mitch to be charming, elegant, and engaging. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitchell Culver.
Thanks, Susan. I really appreciate that introduction. And I'm excited to be presenting here today about this topic. I briefly want to say this is an unusual departure from a lot of the things that I think people are used to hearing me talk about. A lot of times people want to hear me talk about analytics or change management or pedagogy or educational leadership. Nepantla is a diversity topic that I became very familiar with because I taught diversity in education for 4 years at Utah State University. I had some wonderful professors who kind of introduced me to these concepts, and then I was privileged to be able to teach them to other pre-service, in-service teachers, superintendents and principals who were doing their graduate work. And so from 4 years lecturing on this, this is a condensed version of a lot of content that I feel is very near and dear to my heart. And so it is probably a topic that you're not going to hear me talk about very much, although I can talk for hours and hours, at least 43 hours I can talk about this stuff. But generally, this is a part of my identity that is more scholarly. And if you get me in front of a classroom, I might be talking about this. But as a university leader, I don't get to talk about this stuff as much, although it's very personal to me. So the title of the presentation, as you can see on the slide, is Discovering Nepantla. We're going to get into Nepantla, what that means. And it says Learning to Live Liminally to Bridge Disparate Worlds. So I want to talk about the agenda here. We're going to talk about liminality. What is liminality? What's that word? What does it mean? Why is it important to human experience? I'm going to introduce you to an author, Gloria Anzaldúa, whose writings influence a lot of this presentation. We're going to learn about the concepts of Nepantla and the Nepantlera. And then we're going to look at some really shining examples of liminal leaders and also principles of radical solidarity. And then finally, we're going to talk about resources and strategies, like how do we live more liminally and how do we sit with uncertainty more effectively? And especially for the theme of the conference, how do we help ourselves when we're feeling marginalized or others who are legitimately marginalized? How do we help them to sit with uncertainty and to feel empowered even in the midst of great disempowerment? So that's a little bit of an agenda. Let's get into this main idea, liminality. This is a word that I'm going to use throughout the presentation. It's a little bit of a funny word. You hear it in academic circles now and again. I wish it was an everyday word. It should be an everyday word. As human beings, we experience liminality all the time, and very rarely label it liminality. And I wonder sometimes if it's because it has so many L's, M's, and N's, like it doesn't roll off the tongue very well, you know, kind of word. But liminality is the experience that one has of unease at a threshold. And so I want to talk about that. What do I mean, unease at a threshold? And why is liminality so crucial to the human experience? So common to the human experience, and yet not often in the vocabulary of most human beings, which is a shame. Liminal experiences are those that ask us to stand at a threshold or at a bridge between two spaces, or between two worlds, or between two time periods in our lives. There is an old and there's a new very often. And as we cross from the old to the new, there is a moment where we are a halt, where the old experience hasn't quite come to an end and the new experience hasn't quite begun. And we are forced to live in a space of uncertainty where we aren't able yet to form a norm around the new space. And all the things we know from our old space may or may not necessarily transfer. So you have had liminal experiences throughout your life. I would say that liminality is part of everyday life, actually. And there are larger moments of liminality that we experience, such as breakups, marriage, getting fired, getting hired. Think about getting hired. You get the call, you've been hired, sign the paperwork, and there's that space between when you know you have the job and your first day that's extraordinarily liminal. Even after you start the new job, you're still in a period of liminality because you haven't quite got the ropes. A lot of times people call you on the phone and you don't know the answer right away. It takes 4 months before you start to get the hang of things and you know what the answer is when people call on the phone. So getting hired is very liminal, lots of uncertainty, lots of newness. Graduation, every graduation speech I've ever heard, the theme of the speech is liminality, but no one ever uses that word. They dance around it. They say this is not the end of one chapter, it's the beginning of another. And you go, you're just describing liminality. Like it's one of the most common human experiences. And like they never use that word, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how do we transition? How do we navigate a transition successfully and really be empowered in a space that is often disempowered? Losing a loved one, whether that's through death or like up here breakups or whatever it is, or marriage. You know, the marriage speeches are often about liminality. They never use that word. We aren't losing a daughter, but we're gaining a son, right? There's this old and this new, right? Like we always dance around this concept. Coming out, staying in is very liminal for people who have to exist in a heteronormative space, and living life as a queer individual. It can be incredibly hard. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Divorce, parenting is kind of vicarious liminality. You're watching your kids transition in these spaces where they're not quite able to walk, but they're able to throw themselves off furniture, and you're like, no, like it's very frustrating. Um, preteen, right? Dad, can I have Instagram? Like, whoa, like we're not ready for this. Like, you're a child. Go and watch some like Dora the Explorer or Bluey or something. Don't ask me for Instagram. There's a lot of liminality in parenting. Joining a religion, leaving a religion, very liminal. If you have some significant physical injury or develop a disability, it's extraordinarily liminal. Again, does the word come up? I'm not sure. And whatever else human beings are doing, they're existing in liminal spaces. This threshold, this moment between worlds. Now, I eventually, I've dealt with liminality a lot because I used to be a transitions coordinator at universities. And so I would train all my peer mentors about liminality and stuff. And I'm like, you can't use that word with new students and incoming students, but liminality was really what we were talking about. The new student orientation and first year seminars and first year experiences, like what we're trying to resolve is the tension of being caught between worlds. Not being a high school student, but not really understanding the role of a college student. And I came across this image. This is called the Flammarion engraving. Its origins are a little bit sketchy. We don't know the artist. We don't know what year or century it was developed in. The bottom says Urbi et Orbi. This was originally a woodcut. It has been colorized. The original would have been in black and white. But it's interesting for a lot of reasons. Urbi et Orbi means from the city to the world, or the city meaning Rome, from Rome to the world. And this is a pilgrim. This is a pilgrim's outfit, and he's on pilgrimage. And along his pilgrimage, he has obviously, something has gone wrong or awry, and he's fallen through the firmament of heaven, and he's trapped. And so I saw this in a completely different context related to architecture and mathematical equations and stuff. But I saw it and I thought, oh my goodness, I've been trying to explain people liminality for years. This is a single image that captures liminality quite well. Here we have a person who is wearing robes of a pilgrim. To a certain extent, that indicates that they're well-spoken, well-traveled, that they have good financing. It's another way of saying that they've done well in the previous world, the world that they're leaving behind. I don't know how they fell through the firmament of heaven, but here they are. They're on their knees, and whatever is going to go on beyond this veil is going to be exciting. But you can see it's obviously very disorienting. The pilgrim's down on his knees, and you get a sense that he can't even see which way is up. And that while he may gain his bearings and may ultimately be successful in this new space, it is not going to be easy going early on. Early on, it's going to be very disorienting and uncomfortable. And in fact, he could get to a space where he could be quite successful, as successful, or even more successful as a result of the growth that he's about to experience in the new world. But that in order to get to that success, he's going to have to go through the liminal experience of trying to find the bearings. And so there was a great deal of uncertainty and discomfort in his pose, being down on his knees. But there's also a great sense of wonderment and awe with that outstretched hand. And that hand is almost saying, I'm amazed and I feel drawn to the new space. And yet he is in this threshold. Will the pilgrim depart the world and enter the new space and address and deal with the liminality? Or will the pilgrim shut the liminality out and go back to the space of comfort and get back on the journey to the holy city and forget all about this weird experience where he fell through the firmament? And so I think that this captures quite well liminality and helps people to see that they know what liminality is. We've all been here. We've all been on our knees and simultaneously desiring to stretch out our hand and to say, what could this be? What might be possible? There are conflicting emotions in liminality. At that threshold, at that bridge, where you have one foot on each side of the river, fear of the unknown, frustration, anxiety, self-doubt, overwhelm. A lot of these are negative or negatively valenced emotions. Curiosity, something that has some desire in it and some positivity. Confusion, insecurity, loneliness, seclusion, threat, stress, awe, sadness, uncertainty, anticipation, boredom, freedom, excitement, confidence, lack of confidence, longing, joy. These are liminal emotions. And it's why the word, just like Jackie says in the chat, is such a powerful word, is because with one word, for those who have been introduced, with one word, you can capture so much paradox and capture so much of the human spirit. Because whatever else liminality is, we are all friends with it. We have all been there. We have all done that. What's very strange from a linguistic perspective is that not using the word, we have a tremendous number of ways of expressing liminality. Most of these are idiomatic in nature, meaning that unless you're native, they don't really make sense, and you can explain them or you can learn them. But this is why liminality is it's hard to put words to, because we look at these phrases and we know instantly what they mean. But I don't know that all of us have like thought, oh, but that's just a liminal phrase. It's just a phrase about the uncertainty of being at a threshold, right? We're at a crossroads, right? Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled by. In limbo, like we even go to like, we resort to this religious, like dogma, like, doctrinal, like limbo, in order to get around using the word liminal. I think that's kind of interesting. Up in the air, on the fence, a foot in both worlds, in a gray area. So such a gray area, in no man's land, in flux, at sixes and sevens, stuck in the middle. You can see the rest. So I do think it's interesting that idiomatically we we face down liminality by resorting to idiomatic phrases that everyone kind of understands, and like we say them offhand, and then we take them in, but reality is that nobody just says, oh well, you're in a liminal moment, and you're gonna have to sit with it. Like whatever else liminality is, it requires patience and time to pass and these kinds of things. So so I do think that's interesting linguistically. So and Susan, yeah, we're going to talk about A Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's very liminal. I want to introduce you to Gloria Anzaldúa. Gloria, I was introduced to Gloria by reading her book La Frontera, The Borderlands. And in it, she writes about the new mestiza, which you can read the book to learn about what that is. But the whole book is about embracing liminality. And her whole career, the thrust of much of her career was about helping others to see the power of liminality, the strength that we can find in uncertainty. And so you can get this book, you can read this book, it's a good book, but there's lots of books about liminality, but this is my favorite. And she is such a good guide towards becoming more familiar with liminality because her life was full of liminal experiences. She grew up, she was born in Texas in 1942, and she grew up in the Rio Grande Valley. And it's down along the Rio Grande at the border between Texas and Mexico. And she lived in Harlingen, which is here on the map. McAllen is the red dot there, and Brownsville is the other red dot on the border on the Rio Grande. And Harlingen's halfway between those dots. Just to give you an idea of how far south this is, McAllen is 350 miles from San Antonio. So this is like South Texas. And what's interesting about this space, this borderland, is that it is a very unique part of the United States. I grew up there. I lived in McAllen for 3 years in middle school. And what you learn is that the Border Patrol, some 50 years ago, stopped trying to control immigration at the Rio Grande because it's very hard to control immigration when you only control one half of a river, or one side of a river. There is another river in South Texas called the Nueces, again, 100 miles south of San Antonio. And you can see it there. It flows from, Midwestern Texas down to Corpus. And the Nueces is a river that we control both sides of. And you will find more strong security measures in place at the Nueces than you will at the Rio Grande. And what is effectively has happened is that these borderlands, this 250-mile stretch of Texas, is fully integrated with families of mixed status, people who are American citizen, people who have arrived undocumented, people who are seeking asylum, people who have lived their whole lives in the United States, but who are not citizens. And in this space, there are even little cities, micro cities called colonias, which don't have paved roads and they don't have electricity, or at least much electricity. They don't have running water. But they have these different little structures, and maybe thousands of people will live in one colonias. And the Border Patrol knows that they're there, but there's so much uncertainty in trying to enforce border law that they just kind of like let it be. Because so long as people who are not documented can't make it past the Nueces, why are we worried about it? And so they sit with this uncertainty. They allow it to exist. And Gloria grew up in this space, and I can speak from experience of living in that space, that it is a very wonderful place. And it's a place full of confusion. When I was there, the sheriff of the county was indicted for money laundering and drug trafficking and stuff. That was insane. What was more insane is later the county judge was indicted for similar things. And later, the district attorney who had indicted the judge and the sheriff was eventually indicted himself. Then the next sheriff was indicted, and that sheriff's son was indicted. And someone once told me, and I wasn't able to verify this, but someone once told me after the second sheriff was indicted, that was the 17th sheriff in a row that had been indicted in Rio Grande Valley. And so you can see that it truly is a borderland, that what's going on in Rio Grande Valley is not going on almost anywhere else in the United States. And yet it's okay. Like, it's a wonderful place. I love the people of the Rio Grande Valley, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for the way that this very uncertain situation is managed. I moved there when I thought all laws were cut and dried, and learned that people who talk as if border control is simple, they don't understand. Border control is not simple. It is highly liminal, and that's okay. And there is uncertainty, and there's no one approach that is going to be successful. In any case, she grew up in this place, and she went to university about 3 miles from my middle school at Pan American University, which is now UT RGV. And while there, she started thinking about this reality that the borderlands are a very unique place to live and to find power. And like, her life was full of these paradoxes that she had to sit with and not always resolve, but to live liminally. And so I want to take you through some of those examples. So in the first place, traditional gender roles. Her family was of Mexican heritage, and obviously Marianismo, machismo are strong paradigms of the Mexican culture. And yet she found herself drawn to feminist authors, feminist ideals, studying in college Chicana feminist scholarship, and feeling so empowered by it, and yet trying to reconcile that with the traditional gender roles that she had with her family and in her community at large, and that was not easy. How could she step out as a feminist thought leader when everything that had led her into adulthood had trained her to be traditionally oriented towards gender? So this was hard, and she writes about this, and how do you navigate? How do you succeed? She was born in America. She was born in Texas. She's American, and yet her Mexican heritage is a rich part of her lived experiences. And so constantly having to reconcile those two things. And obviously in Rio Grande Valley, that's just a way of life. That's normal. But as she started to move around, lived in California, and started becoming a thought leader elsewhere, these two things did not always reconcile. And so there was a great amount of liminality she had to sit with. Obviously, in that Marianismo, machismo, there's a great deal of heteronormativity. She identifies as queer, and so it is very hard for her to navigate. How do I understand and relate to other people, particularly of Spanish heritage, of Mexican heritage, where that's maybe not the most accepted path or journey to be on? And so having to live with the liminality of that. When she was a child, you speak English at school. If you slip into Spanish, that's a no-no. And when you speak Spanish at home, if you slip into English, that's a no-no. And so it's this weird where the authority figures were always upset with her, no matter what she was doing. If she code switched, which is very common, particularly in that area of the country, she was getting in trouble. No matter who the authority was, they were always having trouble with her language. In her books, she code switches without explanation. So she'll be writing in English, and then she'll just switch over to a Spanish word and then switch back to English. She doesn't help the reader. She doesn't care. She talks about this in her writing, saying, look, if you can't sit with the discomfort of me code switching and using a Spanish word that's a better word, and you figuring out what that means for you, I don't know, what am I supposed to do? I can't. You're either going to read my book or you're not, but I'm not going to help you every little step of the way. If you don't have Spanish, maybe pick some Spanish up as you go. Very interesting. She thought this would resolve when she was in college and she started to become a person of letters. That as she became a thought leader and an author, she thought that her like language troubles were over. No, because when she got to California, the Chicana feminist scholars in California couldn't bear her Tex-Mex dialect, which is a legitimate dialect. Just a favorite example is in Tex-Mex, obviously in English, we call carpeting carpet. And in Tex-Mex, you call it carpeta. And that's just what you call it. That's the word. That's the only word she ever knew for carpet was carpeta. That's the only thing she ever learned. When she got to California and she started interacting with Chicano feminist scholars who did not speak Tex-Mex dialect, and she said carpeta, they would all laugh at her and shame her. Because in true Spanish or high Spanish, you say alfombra and not carpeta. And this was incredibly upsetting to her. And she thought she was amongst friends, and here she was being shamed for having low Spanish or Tex-Mex, even though it's a legitimate dialect. That's just one example. There's lots of Tex-Mex examples, but it is a marginalized dialect. And finally, one of the stories I find most compelling is there was all these taboos related to the body that were associated with her Mexican heritage, but also just generally in society, the amount of shaming that goes on for like feminine hygiene issues, like literally, like it's absurd that we do this still, but it goes on. And she lived in that world, but also she had polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS. And for those of you who know, PCOS can be incredibly painful. And one of the effects that can happen is early onset menses. Gloria started menstruating as a 6-year-old. And because of the taboos related to the body that were prevalent in her culture and at her home, she had no help. Her mother would give her menstrual rags and send her out to the outhouse. This would have been circa 1948. And like she just had to deal with it. You're 6, go deal with this. Like she was made to feel dirty. She was made to feel wrong. She was made to feel less than because she had PCOS, undiagnosed PCOS. And as a father, I think about my kids and how hard and confusing it would be to be sent to an outhouse every day for a week each month to deal with that by yourself. And I think she writes about this very clearly, and it's one of the reasons why I'm compelled by her, that it was a lot of the uncertainty that that situation created for her was where she had to find strength in the midst of uncertainty. Because although there was all of this stigma related to early onset menses, there was a tremendous amount of practicality and pragmatism that she had to find for herself. And that in finding the pragmatics of that situation to make it work for herself as a 6-year-old, as a 7-year-old, as an 8-year-old, as a 9-year-old, she found tremendous power in what had been very uncertain and uncomfortable. And it was sitting with that and in being forced to sit with that in a traumatic way that she found voice, that she found agency, that she found pragmatics, that she found a way through the mess towards feeling a sense of agency and a sense of power over her own body. And so I'm tremendously compelled by that. So you can see that her writings are full and rich of interesting stories, of interesting guidance about how to navigate liminality. And so in her writing, she introduces this concept, this Nahuatl concept. The Nahuatl people are descendants of Aztecs or the indigenous people of Mexico. And the Nahuatl word for liminality or the space between worlds is Nepantla. And if one becomes a master of Nepantla, it is said that you are the Nepantlera. You become a Nepantlera, an individual who elects to sit with discomfort and bridge disparate worlds. And that in choosing to become a Nepantlera, you not only can sit with your own liminality, but you can guide others through liminal experiences. By being a master of liminality, you can see others who are marginalized by any number of situations where they are forced to exist between disparate worlds and suffer. And you, in that alliance, you can guide and help them to also find agency in a situation of disempowerment or uncertainty. You can help people to see the opportunity to stretch out their hand and have a sense of awe or joy or wonderment in the midst of something that is so disorienting that it has you on your knees. Now, I have found myself in this space quite a lot and have become increasingly comfortable with liminality to the point now where things get very uncertain, I get very calm and peaceful, even joyful. This recently happened. My dad had an aneurysm rupture last month, 6 weeks ago, and he had to be life flighted to a big hospital, and he was in the neuro ICU for a month. And during that month, he went nonverbal, and then he got his language back, which was great. He couldn't read or write, and then now he might be able to read or write. He can read, but can he write? We're not sure. There's all this uncertainty. And we're also trying to learn, like, dad before the stroke, and he had multiple strokes, a major one and some minor ones. We don't know how much damage has been done, and it takes 90 days for them to figure it out. And so there will be this dad after the stroke, but we haven't yet met him yet because they don't know what all of his limitations are. They haven't mapped it yet. He's 82, 83. And so this is a very liminal period for our whole family, for him, for my mom, for all my siblings. And my mom pulled me aside early on and she said, "Hey, I wanted to thank you." I said, "Oh, for what?" She said, "You've been tremendously calm and practical during this. You've helped me remember things that I would have forgotten. You've helped me be mindful of things that I didn't even realize I needed to be mindful of. You've guided me on days where I needed someone to just be strong and guide." And this is in a period where the three most common things that doctors will tell us are, "We don't know, it depends, and we'll have to wait and see." And we're so sick of those answers. My mom and others, one of my brothers pulled me aside and said, "Hey, thanks. Like, you seem to like be at peace when all of us are at chaos." And that's so helpful. And I attribute that to trying to live with liminality, trying to follow the path of Nepantla, to be a Nepantlero, and really to sit with uncertainty and not have to resolve it, but still find power to act. And I think that this is really critical. And we have just briefly, some shining examples of the Nepantla. Gloria Anzaldúa, she inspired scholars across the globe to embrace liminality, to recapture the identity of being marginalized, and to transform a position of vulnerability into a position that was also quite skilled and powerful. And she bridges those two worlds by saying, yes, marginalization is real. And finding empowerment in marginalization is also real. But the empowerment doesn't eliminate the marginalization. It doesn't resolve the marginalization. And I think this is critical because it's very easy to say, well, of course, the goal of any work that we do with a person who's feeling marginalized is to end the marginalization. Turns out you can't. You're going to end the patriarchy tomorrow. You're not, right? The patriarchy is going to continue to exist. Even if we feel empowered in a space that is patriarchal, it doesn't mean that the patriarchy has ended. And I think this is really critical to understand that there is a space where you have one foot in empowerment, and yet the marginalization continues, and you must remain marginalized. And Gloria helps us to find peace in that space and to find agency in that space. And so this is important to realize that Nepantla the tools of the Nepantla are not necessarily resolving the tension, are not necessarily eliminating the oppression, because that's sometimes not practical or realistic or possible. And yet there's a tremendous amount of empowerment found in sitting with the liminality and working through the liminality and aligning, like building an alliance in the marginalization, even if the resolution is not possible. Another shining example of Nepantla is Bell Hooks. Some of you may know she always keeps her full name lowercase. She's an author, one of my favorite authors. She inspired educators to see classrooms as places of vulnerability for both students and teachers alike. By taking a multidisciplinary approach, Bell Hooks showed millions of teachers that schools easily become places of oppression unless we challenge systems from within, using love, logic, and open, patient communication. What do I mean challenging them from within? One of her books, Teaching to Transgress, is all about how do you do things a little bit outside the line. What's amazing is in all of her writing, she always talks about doing great teaching within bounds. And kind of the concepts that Bell Hooks deals with are this notion of great teaching is often non-conventional, and yet those non-conventional approaches that will get you in trouble with people who are in charge, like principals and superintendents, are always best when defensible within pedagogical theory. So you may be doing something that's non-conventional based on the system you're a part of, but that is grounded in pedagogy that actually makes it defensible. And so your principal can show up and say, hey, tisk tisk, I'm going to wag my finger at you for doing something non-conventional. And you can turn and say, well, don't you know the theories of XYZ theorist and all the research that supports XYZ approach? Like, I can send you readings. Like, do you want me to like help you to catch on that this is really the better way to do it? So bell hooks really wants us to go outside the lines, but wants us to stay in bounds. And this is a liminality that we have to, that she constantly writes about. How do we do this great non-conventional work and yet do it in a way that doesn't upend the whole system? Because that is possible. It's hard, but it's possible. Moving very quickly, just realizing we're short on time. Paulo Freire helped readers to see that unless the oppressed pursue freedom in a just manner, they risk becoming oppressors themselves under the new system. He had seen this play out consistently, where oppressed people would throw off an oppressive regime, and then they would set themselves up as oppressors of someone else or the previous group and get revenge or whatever it was. And he argues in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you can't do that. It's the worst way to resolve the tension of oppression is to become an oppressor. So by fostering dialogue and collaboration, even with one's oppressors, which is what he advocates, Freire argued that oppressed have the best chance of reclaiming their agency through a path that is just, but that does not risk becoming oppressive, right? So there is a desire to have freedom from oppression. That is a good desire. While you pursue that, you must keep another foot in the land or space of being free from being oppressive. And that is almost as hard. And balancing the two is not always possible. And this is what he argues about and advocates for. And there's a really good example of this in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 1996. Those hearings aim to address the atrocities of apartheid through radical open testimony. Basically, victims would share their experiences of suffering. And then the perpetrators could actually gain amnesty by fully and publicly confessing their roles and actions that they could prove were politically motivated, but actions that included murder, rape, infanticide, torture, awful things. And they were completely forgiven and received full amnesty as often as it was shown that they were doing it based on orders or based on the police motivation or the military motivation, so long as they would fully and publicly confess. Now, that's a radical process. It emphasized healing through dialogue, promoting accountability without seeking revenge. Journalist Angie Krogh, she chronicles this in her book, Country of My Skull. I don't necessarily recommend that book. It's thick. There is a movie version of it. I don't recommend the movie either. It's Juliette Binoche and Samuel L. Jackson. But there are scenes in it of the hearings that I find very compelling. And if you just watch the hearing scenes, like on YouTube clips, that can be enough. But this required the country to have radical solidarity and mutual recognition. Both the oppressed and the oppressors worked towards collective reconciliation, and that's what made it possible. It wasn't like a lark. It didn't go over as smoothly as they probably would have liked, but it was their path to pursuing the concept of Ubuntu, which is what is good for me is good for you. What is good for you is good for me. What is bad for you is bad for me. What is bad for me is bad for you. And so can we find a path that isn't vengeful? And they found this path. And this is a picture of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he talks about this in his writings, about the desire for justice and pursuing that while maintaining a foot in the space of the peace of mercy. And that is incredibly hard and was incredibly empowering to this situation of oppression and marginalization. All right, Nepantla often report both discomfort and joy when navigating liminality. The discomfort arises from the constant tension of living between worlds. However, Nepantla also experiences joy in this space as they have ability to bridge gaps, create new meaning, and shape transformative change. If you want to live in this space, if you want to help others live in this space, here's some guidance that I have, and then we can move to some questions or commentary. First, practice self-reflection, journal, be mindful, develop awareness of how you're navigating liminal spaces and how often you're there and the emotions you experience. embrace the ambiguity, accept that you don't have to resolve every point of tension of a liminal space, that you can navigate the both and rather than having to force it to be either or, and that is incredibly powerful and important. Cultivate empathy and actively listen, right? Deeply listen to other people's stories, particularly people who are different from you, and extend empathy. Don't try to solve people's discomfort, but try to just understand their liminality. Often it is accepting and understanding liminality that actually leads to resolution of liminality rather than trying to solve it, which often can make it worse or intensify it. Next, develop cultural competency, read, travel, be vulnerable, participate in dialogue. And finally, build community and collaboration. Liminality is easier to navigate with others. Create spaces where people can come together to share their experiences of tension, difference, and transition. There's some readings, the ones I've talked about already. Number 4, Gastambide Fernandez. This is an awesome paper on radical solidarity. And then A Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell is explored in this film, Finding Joe. Again, I don't recommend the whole film, but there are some compelling interviews that are highlighted in the film that really get at the power of liminality and accepting this. That is the whole presentation. We have 4 minutes left. Let's see if I can look at some of the comments that just recently came in. Thank you for saying sorry about my dad's stroke. Terry Tempest Williams, absolutely wonderful. Susan, do you want to say more about Terry?
Yeah, because she does in that book of Fractured, she does use the mosaic as a motif, that you take the fractured pieces of porcelain and turn them into a thing of beauty. Catherine asked a question about, is art in some form perhaps a primary vehicle needed to navigate this space?
I do think that there's books about that principle exactly, that sometimes art becomes the way that we express the inexpressible, particularly music, and that in finding that expression, we find the resolution of having to live with it. Like, right, we express and then we accept. And I do think that there's something about that that's cathartic and that, or could say therapeutic, and that art is often a way to engage or accept the ambiguity, because art, whatever else it is, has a great deal of ambiguity in it. Quick books list for those who want to read more. Yeah, read Borderline first, and then there. It really depends on how you respond to that. I think all of these, Teaching Transgressive Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Gastambide Fernandez's paper on radical solidarity are all really good. They may not even use the word liminal, but they're talking about it. And then I'll send the slides out. I really appreciate being able to present. It looks like we don't have any other questions, so thank you. And yeah, enjoy living liminally.
Thank you so much, Mitch. This has just been fabulous.
Thanks, Susan. Good to be with you.